I call this seeing the differences because information is a difference which makes a difference. The information designer selects and encodes differences. Studying examples of information design from many time periods and many cultures helps us understand how to shape hierarchies and networks to create patterns that connect. And patterns that connect are the pathways for accessing differences. I call this a new history because I want you to see that information design is an action for a purpose. It's there to serve a function. I'm very fond of the number 9, so I'm really happy that I could organize this history into 9 functional themes. The 9 themes are cosmology and theological narratives, world, kingdom, and city maps, transportation, genealogy and lineage, timelines, scientific explanation, economic trends, mechanical controls, and engineering and business process. Perhaps the first function of information design is to describe our relationship to sacred space. When I look up as I enter the Romanesque church in Conques, my attention is focused on the Last Judgment. The designer of this relief wanted to communicate with several audiences. Perhaps my attention is drawn to the figures right over the doorway. Am I going to heaven or am I going to hell? I can immediately see this thin line between reward and punishment. Or perhaps I've listened to Bible stories and the position of the visual groups reinforce my idea of what is good and what is evil. Or perhaps I'm a monk and I can actually read Latin. So I can read the texts inscribed in the frame surrounding the groups. That text over the doorway reads, "O sinners, know that unless you change your ways, there will be a hard judgment." We need to expand our preconceptions of where we find information design. Let me show you 2 places that really expanded my sense of this. The first is Dunhuang. This is a man-made cave complex in central China. This was once a major entry and exit point for the overland trade between China and the West. This is a photo of what it looks like in the winter. In the summer, it's got an awful lot of tourists walking around. There are nearly 500 painted caves at this site. They were created between 400 and 1400. But I'll only talk about this one. I'm going to zoom into this cave that was dug out and painted in the year 950. It's known as Cave 61. Cave 61 is shaped like the interior of a large tent, which is based on models from India. I'm going to talk about the mural on the rear wall. It's about 50 feet long, so that's about the size of the front of this auditorium, and it's about 12 feet high. Here's what the mural looks like today. It represents Wutaishan, which is 5 Terrace Mountain. It's a famous pilgrimage site in central China. I've drawn some outlines to help you see the 5 mountains, and they're labeled with the cardinal directions. The pilgrimage road starts on a road up the south peak, and then it runs from the south peak to the west, to the central peak, to the north peak, and then to the east peak, and a road that completes the journey. When you're standing up close to the wall, you can see how the painting presents 3 visual layers. There's a very stylized landscape in the background. On top of that are people, animals, and plants and buildings. And on top of this are place names and religious sayings. Someone must have acted as the overall designer, the director of the composition. This designer used relative size to communicate information. Monks are always taller than pilgrims. Celestial beings are always larger than pilgrims or monks. He also used space to locate information. The entire composition is divided into 3 tiers. Roughly, there's celestial beings along the top, pilgrims along the bottom, and priests in the center. That celestial area is rather irregular. It penetrates the mountain peaks rising up into the sacred space. And these marks in yellow show you where celestial emanations descend down into the middle zone. The marks in red and blue here show how the slants of the roof lines draw the viewer's eye into the curved space. The roof lines are all pointed upward towards the beginning of the pilgrimage. The roof lines of the central temple create a peak aligned with the central mountain. And as we walk past the central mountain, the space starts to curve outward. Now the roof line slants downward, and this curved space comes back towards us, and the composition ends at a walled gate similar to the one where it began on the opposite side. So the viewer who walks this 50-foot mural has figuratively trekked 150 miles and visited dozens of temples. But when you walk this corridor behind the stone screen today, what you can see and feel is this curved space, but you need a flashlight. There's no natural light in the cave, and up close, you can only see a few feet of the mural at a time. The images that I'm showing you here are actually from a project that digitized the wall. So what function did it serve to create a narrative map representing hundreds of figures and temples inside of a cave? Some experts suggest that the cave was used for religious ceremonies, and visitors gathered merit by experiencing some kind of a virtual pilgrimage. Others point to the lack of soot from torches, and they suggest that once the cave was painted, it was never used. Perhaps the act of encoding this kind of sacred narrative onto a wall was the entire function of the design. The second example can be found on the eastern side of Paris. The Palais de la Porte was created for the International Colonial Exhibition in 1931. This event turned part of Paris into a theme park celebrating French colonies around the world. The palace was the only building that was planned as a permanent structure. While it's no longer a museum of the French colonies, the facade survives intact to the present day. Alfred Janniot designed the facade. His assignment was to represent the natural resources of what was then known as Greater France. He chose the shallow bas-relief style he saw on fragments of Angkor Wat, which were arriving from Cambodia in Paris. These are two pieces of the elaborate composition he created, combining images of plants and animals from the Museum of Natural History, photographs of people in local costume, and live models that came to Paris. On the left is Janniot working on the panel about Dahomey, which is modern Benin. The people in that panel are gathering pine nuts and making palm oil. The next panel here shows people gathering elephant ivory in Congo. The right panel shows people farming rice and gathering coffee in Cochinchine, which is modern Vietnam. The composition was modeled in clay in the studio. You see Janniot here working on the clay model, and then carved on stone blocks, and the blocks were reassembled and mounted on the building's facade. The sculpture represents the colonial subjects harvesting resources for France. The names of the colonies and the products were engraved in stone inside the composition. I've placed the names of the colonies above and the harvested products below on this slide. The left side of the building represents the Caribbean and African colonies. Sugar, ivory, palm oil, and wood are being passed up to waiting ships and carried to France. The right side represents Asia and the Pacific. Rice, pepper, rubber, tea, and fish are lifted upward and carried to France. There's no mention of the French monopoly on the opium trade. In the center is a symbol of France, receiving ships that are arriving from all directions. The French Republic takes the form of Europa and her bull, surrounded by Greco-Roman goddesses. So the original function of this design was to illustrate the economic benefits of the colonies to France. Today it functions as a catalog of plants, animals and birds, indigenous population, and modes of production that existed in these parts of the world in the 1930s, and how they were valued by the French. The result is this hybrid of natural history and the cosmology of colonialism. The second theme is world, kingdom, and city maps. A map is a diagram of a place. It shows us physical relationships among the details, and it may or may not apply a consistent mathematical projection. I propose here that maps fulfill three major functions. A world map shows us the relationship among the parts of the known world. Al-Idrisi created a compendium of the known world for King Roger of Sicily. He gathered information from Greek, Roman, Arabic, Turkic, and Christian sources. His map is oriented toward the south, with Mecca in the center. If we place north at the top, we can recognize the outline of the world as we know it today: the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. A kingdom map, on the other hand, combines physical space and political influence to represent a part of the world. It shows us the shape and extent of our territory separated from their territory. This image of Europe as a queen was an expression of the Habsburgs' claim to a kingdom known as the Holy Roman Empire. We can see major rivers and cities depicted within the female body. And if we align this with a 20th century history map, we can see the corresponding areas. The crown is all of Iberia, the heart is Bohemia, and the lower edge of the robe is the southern edge of Greece. The third function of maps is to represent the urban centers of civilization, the city. The Turgot map of Paris was designed by Berthez to display the city's architectural grandeur. It was engraved on 20 copper plates, printed and then bound into books. Berthez measured every building in the city. He used an isometric projection to record the architecture in one vertical scale. So that nothing would block view of the buildings, he flattened all the city's hills. He widened the streets to expose their names. To make the city appear orderly, the streets are empty. But to represent commerce, the river is filled with boats. When you look at this, in general, we keep the water and the land space separate in our minds. And Berthez used this to separate the scale of the city from the scale of the river. When you look at the map, you don't really notice that the boatmen are giants and those ships are enormous. There's still a lot of buildings in the city that appear on this map. When I worked in Paris, my office was in this building. And when you compare that view to a current digital map, you can see how Berthez's distortions made the location of the buildings and the streets a lot easier to understand. Transportation diagrams are designs that assist the viewer to perform a universal task, getting from here to there. The primary function is to support travel decisions within a network. These travel decisions differ depending on whether you're moving over land, over the sea, or through an urban transportation system. The Peutinger table, or the Peutinger map, illustrates how transportation diagrams benefit from a distortion that focuses on the network. The original is a set of 11 sheets that are about 1 foot high, and when they're strung together, about 22 feet long. You can see part of it along the top of the slide here. It's a record of the Roman road network as it was around the year 250. The diagram below shows how each of the 11 sheets covers different amounts of territory on the modern map. You can see how the roads closest to Rome, that's sheets 3, 4, and 5, have the most detail, while the sections that are farthest from Rome have the least. This contemporary map shows the area of the Roman world represented on the Peutinger map. The colored dots show the number of locations recorded on the map and the lines show the roads that are represented. This horizontal map is oriented northeast to southwest, and the vertical space is highly compressed. This is done by essentially removing the space covered by water, which is of no interest to someone who's traveling by land, and reducing the space between the locations that are not connected by roads. So here is Canterbury in southern England, separated from the continent by a small amount of water. Here is Rennes in Brittany, Toulouse in southern France, and Delez on the Algerian coast. The map also uses symbols to represent different types of towns and services for travelers. On this sheet of Italy, Rome stands out from the other towns, personified as a king. The travelers can see where they can find temples, thermal baths, and warehouses to pick up additional material. So this map of a Paris subway line, it uses the same kind of compression of space. In the diagram above the train car door, the two unconnected sections are shown as parallel lines. But these two parts actually diverge quite a bit in real space. But that information is really not important to most of the travelers. Transportation diagrams for urban networks became very important as cities grew, and by the 1930s, the various electric railways that served London had merged into the underground. Underground maps began to resemble a plate of colorful spaghetti. Then in 1933, the London Underground published this transportation diagram, which was designed by Harry Beck, and this became the reference for all urban networks that followed. Beck restricted the lines to a horizontal and a diagonal grid. This reduces the visual noise created by the many irregular curves and uneven spaces between the lines. As Joel Katz has pointed out, Beck's diagram was built around the appropriate unit of measure for this kind of a diagram, the stop. The physical distance between stations was distorted to make it easier for the traveler to read the diagram. Beck spread out the stations in the center of the city to make space for their names, and he decreased the space between the outlying stations to fit them on the diagram. Transportation diagrams contain the information that are needed by that traveler. Sailing charts present a useful contrast to road maps. The pattern of wood and shells on this chart represent the swells between islands. It was created by a navigator traveling by canoe among the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific. The sailor reads the interaction between the landforms and the prevailing winds. That chart summarizes the information he needs to know before he travels on the ocean. Sailing charts for ships with deep hulls and a longer range needed additional information. They needed compass headings and depth measurements. Wagner's book of charts for Northern Europe combined 4 elements to direct a ship: coastal silhouettes to help you recognize distant landmarks, typical coastal landscapes to help guess where the harbor is located, and then rhumb lines and depth measurements to guide the approach towards land. Genealogy and lineage diagrams have a purpose of recording descent relationships. The primary function is a representation of either inherited value or inclusion or position in a religious, political, or cultural community. This is the genealogy of Charlemagne from the Nuremberg Chronicles. This uses an organic metaphor of a vine connecting the emperor of the Franks to his ancestors. We can compare this to the common descent diagram on the right, and we can see here is Saint Arluf, here is Charles Martel, and here's Charlemagne. Lineage can also be shown by proximity with no connecting lines, as it is in these 3 paintings that depict a Tibetan Lama's lineage. The current Lama is in the center with his predecessor at his feet. Milarepa on the left is the teacher of Gampopa, who's on the right, and each of them are surrounded by predecessors and descendants. And it can also be implied by a linear progression. Rudolf Zallinger, who's an important scientific illustrator, developed The Progress of Man in 1965. He used differences in posture and body hair to represent the evolution of the human animal. He also puts representative tools in the hands of some of these ancestors. Modern man from 1965 has a much better haircut than the others, but he's not yet carrying a cell phone. So maps and transportation diagrams, as we've seen, generally illustrate space. The purpose of a timeline is to present relationships in time. European timelines from the 18th and 19th century are all struggling to synthesize competing views of time. One of the most influential is Joseph Priestley's New Chart of History, which synthesizes events found in classical texts and modern history. It begins in 1200 BC with Egyptians and Israelites. The vertical dimension are the modern nations, and they're here to represent the rise and fall of empires through the year 1800. He applies color to group together the parts of the empire that span current nations. So we can see the Roman Empire span Africa and Europe, skipping over China, India, and Persia. And along the bottom, he has a list of famous people. Frederick Strauss's Streams of Time add ancient civilization, starting around 1500 after the creation of the world, which emerges from the clouds along the top. The streams flow into a stomach that's the Roman Empire, and then they diverge into modern nations. Civilization flows from 9 streams: Italian, Greek, Asia Minor, Assyrian, Syrian, Phoenician, Jews, Egyptian, Chinese. There's also a stream for great figures. And the American translation by William Bell adds streams for invention and cities. Also from America, Emma Willard created this history textbook as part of her educational program for American women. She designed this architectural memory palace. The pillars of centuries hold up the ceiling covered by categories of famous people. The back wall was the creation in the year 4004 BC. The empires flow along the floor, where she's added a glowing star to mark the birth of Christ. And the modern nations are all in the foreground, where we can see that the English and Spanish empires part to reveal the Republic of America. I noticed when I got a high enough resolution of this that she's actually sketched in the name Zachary Taylor, because that was the person who was president of the United States the year that this was published. So she had to add a little bit of information down on the bottom. The winter count tradition among the people of the North American plains was another way of representing time. This is Lone Dog's winter count painted on a buffalo robe. A year was recorded by designing a mnemonic pictogram to represent the significant events, and then organized in a spiral. This is another winter count drawn in ink and colored pencil on cotton muslin. These are materials used by the people after they were confined to reservations. This copy was probably made at the request of a government agent. There's phonetic transcriptions of Dakota language that's been added to each of the pictograms. This gives us some sense of how a literate person could actually read this timeline. And then as scientific concepts of time expanded the past from thousands to millions to billions of years, the scale of time changed radically. In the 20th century, the scientific timeline had to synthesize geologic time, the fossil record of plants and animals, and theories of the formation of stars and planets. Herbert Bayer created the World Geographic Atlas, and he was covering science as well as geography. For a timeline titled The Succession of Life, he controlled the time scale. This is 3,000 million years from the formation of our planet to the present. by designing an outward-facing spiral unfolding into a grid on which he presented the parallel development of animal life, plant life, and geology from the Cambrian to the present. This spiral approach, representing vast periods of time, has influenced many of the current scientific timelines. Which brings us to scientific explanation. This embraces the recording of direct observation and phenomenon of all kinds. One of the richest themes is the depiction of human anatomy. Al-Haytham, who is a native of Basra in Iraq, drew this diagram of the human visual system, those are two eyes and the related optic nerves, as part of his book of optics. He used this diagram to explain how eyes receive reflected light that are focused through lenses inside the eyeball. The Persian physician Mansur created these color-coded diagrams of separate systems of human anatomy. We're looking directly into the human body. The arterial and nervous system are viewed from behind on the left, and major organs and blood circulation viewed from the front on the right. Medical practice was also an important part of the Tibetan monastic tradition. Sangye Gyamtso's treatise also illustrates the body as overlapping systems. On the left are the moxibustion surgery and bloodletting points along those grids, and on the right is the anatomy of the body's most vulnerable parts. If you look very closely, you can see how Gyamtso combined 2- and 3-dimensional views to represent both the surface and what is hidden beneath. Fritz Kahn, who was a medical doctor and popular science writer, was a master at using mechanical metaphor to explain how the human body works. He also employed homunculus, that's the name for those little people inside your head and the other organs who are doing all the thinking and all the work for you. And he used these to describe biochemical processes. Joel Katz employs a similar metaphor of pipes and fluid dynamics to represent the cardiovascular system. This is an approach influenced by the fact that Katz is also a master of transportation diagrams. As many of you know who work here, we use information design to explain our experiments. Sometimes this is done very literally. That's the chemist Antoine Lavoisier employing a solar furnace to burn a diamond and measure the resulting gas. Sometimes we're less literal and more abstract. The language of scientific explanation absorbed many elements already established in the language of theology. In the Nuremberg Chronicle, that hand in the upper left is a visual code for God's act of creation. These hands appear as vectors of action in Galvani's illustration of his experiments with animal electricity. Sometimes we combine the two. That hand appears among the realistic figures and mathematical abstractions of Simon Staven's Principles of the Art of Waiting. Staven understood our ability to combine a depiction of what we can see with the abstraction of what we can think to explain scientific concepts. Even though those men seem to be carrying abstract rectangles, we can actually feel their weight. Sometimes we try to combine everything into a single image. Alexander von Humboldt synthesized his natural history observations from 4 years in South America into a single chart. This was his attempt to communicate a visual understanding of ecology. The closer you look at this diagram, the more detail it presents to the eye. The names of all the plants are located precisely at the altitude where Humboldt collected them. Humboldt's work influenced many other designs, such as this presentation of comparing all the major mountains and all the major rivers of the world in a single chart. On the right, we have all the peaks of the Americas, Asia, and Europe organized by altitude. We can see how high Humboldt climbed when he was in the Andes, and we can compare Gay-Lussac's balloon ascent to the tops of the peaks of the Sierra Nevada and the Himalayas. Antonio Petrocelli's science diagrams from the 60s owe a great deal to this omniscient point of view introduced by Humboldt. Like Steven, he explains the world by combining visual details such as a rainbow or a radio telescope with invisible abstractions such as ionized molecules and radio waves. The remaining three functions are a response to needs that began with our migration from animal to mechanical energy. The entire notion of economic trends required the development of two things: longitudinal data corresponding to political units or business sectors, and the belief that visual patterns had a value beyond the numbers that they were based on. From the later 18th century, several people proposed methods to turn these numbers into visual patterns. William Playfair charted import and export time series as overlapping lines to show his audience the balance of trade. So let's look a little closer at this chart. This is the trade balance between England and North America. And I'm going to redraw the dates down at the bottom so you can see them easier. The imports and exports dropped dramatically in the years just before the American Revolution. This is where the trade balance changes. But during the war years, the imports drop even more, while the exports go up and down. So the trade balance returns to England. August Crome, around the same time, was comparing the area and the population of each part of Europe to explain a theory of national wealth and power. He organized each nation into nested boxes, from the tiny city-state of San Marino, over here on the top, to the Russian Empire, which basically took up the entire chart. At the bottom of this chart are circles that were comparing 20 nations. Circles are the surface area of the state. Sweden is on the far left, and then there's Turkey and European Turkey and Portugal, and Britain is all the way over on the right. The green tangents on the right are the people living in the state. We see that Sweden's territory is very large, but its population is small. The yellow tangent on the left is the public revenue of the state. We see that Britain's revenue kind of dwarfs all the other states. And that blue line descending is the average public revenue contributed by each citizen. And you can see that the Brits were paying very high taxes. Charles Joseph Menard developed a series of representative maps using geography to frame the flow of people and goods. This one shows in green the quantity of grain imported to France from Russia and Ottoman Turkey by sea, and it's comparing it to the overland trade of grain from Austria and Spain in red. But you'll also notice that Menard very freely distorts the geography so that the data can easily flow through the Bosporus. We can visualize these numerical relationships by shading geographical units to represent differences in quantity. Dupin is using shading to show differences in concentration in specific sections of Paris. He associates the darkest shade with the least desirable outcome. In this case, the darkest shade is the largest number of prostitutes. Then we get to William Stanley Jevons and his approach to visualizing fluctuations of value. And this is a clear bridge between the themes of scientific explanation and economic trends. He was a mathematician who made economic line charts what they are today. John Maynard Keynes wrote about him, "The significance of his method may be expressed by saying that he approached the complex economic facts of the real world, both literally and metaphorically, as a meteorologist. In the same sense that wind and rain are created by the weather, the economic numbers he visualized, whether they were the price of fodder or the price of gold, were treated as objective data created by the market." This would later give birth to Charles Dow's average of individual stock prices, representing the health of the market by a single line graph. But visualizing economic trends doesn't need to be neutral. It was only 35 years after emancipation when W.E.B. Du Bois created these charts for the audience of the Paris International Exhibition in 1900. His purpose was to make a previously invisible part of the American population visible to the world. We can't ignore the polemic drive for attention that emerges from these designs. This chart shows the uneven growth of taxable property owned by African Americans in the state of Georgia. 10 years after emancipation, the value is $5.4 million. There's 5 years of very small growth, followed by large growth between 1880 and 1890, and then the Jim Crow laws come in, and we see 10 years of very tiny growth. The total numbers appear like spikes driven into the chart's center. And this is one of the most striking charts. It's a representation of urban and rural population of African Americans in the state of Georgia. The urban population is divided into 3 categories of city populations: green for large cities, blue for the medium, and yellow for small cities. The directions of the lines shift with each color. Then the Negroes living in country and villages, whose numbers represent 86% of the total by my own calculation, they descend into this very tight spiral. This is a piece of evidence from the Pujo Committee Money Trust Report. This was produced by the Senate in 1912, and it's translating an enormous amount of data into a single link node diagram. The purpose of this diagram is to show how J.P. Morgan controlled the U.S. economy. The capital value of each company is the size of the circle, and colored lines are the types of relationship to the Morgan Trust. In the center, we can see a ring of banks connected to industries from railroads to metals to telegraph to insurance companies. Those connections are encoded as types of colored lines to show how each company shares one or more directors or trustees with the banks that were controlled by J.P. Morgan. We can also turn these numbers into symbols that will tell stories. Otto Neurath created the isotype technique to tell complex visual stories by communicating quantity through repeated units using bold outline and clear contrast. This chart shows how the shift of home weaving to factory weaving affected the number of weavers and the production of cloth in England. In 5 rows, we can easily see the ratio of factory weavers eliminating home weavers as cloth production increases tenfold. We can understand this without having to look at the numbers beyond the symbols, but there is a key at the bottom that explains that the blue symbols are the pounds of cloth, the black symbols are home weavers, and the red symbols are factory workers. So you can sort of visually do the math. In 1820, there are 24,000 home weavers and 10,000 factory weavers, and they're producing about 70 million pounds of cloth. In 1880, home weaving has completely disappeared. There's that same total of 25,000 weavers, but now they're all working in the factories, and they're producing 1 billion pounds of cloth. So along with the introduction of mechanical power, what the operator of the machines couldn't hear or see or feel needed to be presented as visual information driven by sensors that were connected to the machine. The instrumentation that appears on vehicle dashboards and control rooms for large mechanical systems generally communicates 2 things: status and quantity. In order to control a machine, the driver of a steam-powered vehicle needed to control pressure, which in turn controlled velocity. Bourdon's invention of a pressure gauge provided the real-time feedback to visualize pressure quantity through a needle's position on a circular dial. Expanding pressure in that tube indirectly moved the needle. The pressure gauge then allowed the driver of a steam locomotive to see and adjust fluctuation of pressure by turning valves. A carriage driver could see what was going on with his horses, and he could feel his own speed. But the operator of an automobile needed visual feedback when he could no longer see what was happening. The only visual display on the first Model T Ford was an ammeter to indicate the status of the battery. Otto Schultz, who like Bourdon was a clockmaker, he invented the speedometer in Germany. It reported distance traveled and velocity through a rotating electromagnet winding a spring. It became standard equipment on automobiles only after there were very many fatal accidents. And then J.W. Jones patented an American version a few years later, and his patent application over here on the right shows how the magnet and the spring move the needle on the dial. The rest of the dashboard filled out with oil pressure, fuel gauge, and a clock. And the addition of heating and air conditioning, as well as radio and other entertainment features, completed the analog controls through the end of the 20th century. As we add sensors, we also add displays. Aircraft required additional instrumentation to support the pilot's ability to control motion in 3 dimensions. These are the 6 essential dials, also known as the basic 6. There's the airspeed, vertical speed, and altimeter gauges, and these are all driven by pressure gauges, pressure sensors. And there are 3 dials driven by gyroscopes that communicate the plane's pitch, direction, and its relationship to the horizon. The solution for monitoring potentially catastrophic activities, such as space flight and power plants, the solution is a hierarchical arrangement of status and quantity controls. This is an image from the Apollo-era NASA mission control, and it illustrates how mechanical controls were broken down into a hierarchy of components arranged in a theater. Each person at a console was assigned to monitor individual sensors, and the directors in the back of the theater received aggregated status reports. The displays have changed, but the control room theater has remained roughly the same for over 50 years. Analog dials and gauges are still the primary engineering metaphor to visualize numbers and their thresholds. Digital displays still communicate continuous change of numeric value by simulating dials and bar gauges. This control display for directional drilling, which is also known as fracking, shows a central dial which indicates the direction of the drill, and it's surrounded by dials that indicate the quantity value coming from signals on the drilling package. The threshold for each signal is mapped to green, yellow, and red areas on the dial. Since digital displays are driven by electronic rather than physical connections, they can easily be aggregated on a screen, and this marvelous marketing image shows a control room, very clean and neat, where multiple wells are being monitored by a single person who's wearing a nice suit. The last group here is engineering and business process, and I've grouped them together because they share similar function and similar visual language. Pre-industrial descriptions of machines are such as this military device on the left and these methods for exploiting silk on the right are essentially, as I've said, descriptive. The reproduction of machine was not the intent of the design. The reproduction of machine was the task of craftspeople who had the tools and the skills and the knowledge to reproduce whatever they needed. Manufacturing driven by mechanical power required interchangeable parts. And the person designing the machine was not the person who was building it. And the person who built it was no longer the person who was running it. When Gaspard Monge developed this technique of descriptive geometry, the French state understood its potential use so well that they declared it a state secret. When his work was finally published after the French Revolution, this method was used to reproduce engineering information. In England, William Farish introduced isometric drawing as a simple method for drawing machine parts. The 3 tools that you see there on the upper left are all that anyone needs to make the drawings. Farish explained how to combine proportional elements that show how gears and other machine parts fit together. Engineering or mechanical drawing developed a rich visual vocabulary of lines, projections, and symbols by the early 20th century. The alphabet of lines described in William French's manual could be combined to make any number of machines. Industrialization also created much more complex business organizations. The railroads spread across hundreds of miles and were among the first businesses to use telegraph to create command and control systems. When Daniel McCallum became the general manager of the New York and Erie Railroad, he was managing 5,000 employees. This is still a fairly good-sized business today, but it was enormous at that time. This chart shows the position and reporting structure of every single employee. Growing from the roots, which are the board of directors at the bottom, the organization opens up like a plant with 5 major trunk lines showing facilities as well as the employee at each trunk. For consumer products to spread, the ergonomic dimensions of the product needed to be specified. This is Ruth O'Brien's pioneering work to standardize the measurement of women's clothing. This kind of standardization was a very important part of clothing manufacturing. Without it, you wouldn't know whether you were a size 2 or a size 6. And there's a similar visual language that appeared and was adapted to communicate business strategy. This is Walt Disney describing his business strategy to use properties from his films to feed and reinforce all parts of his media empire. We zoom in to Disney's diagram and we follow Mickey. We can read that his direction for building synergies are TV, which publicizes products for the music division, music helping to kick off films, and creative talent feeding from the films, providing characters for merchandise licensing. He's created dozens of mutually reinforcing cycles to build corporate value. The information architecture diagrams for large websites provided another form of business strategy. This diagram is from an early website of Nature magazine. The main diagram uses an isometric projection to show the structure of the site, and it was inspired by Turgot's map. The color and elevation were used to represent a critical business issue, the different levels of access to content given to registered users and paid subscribers. And then that blue level was an additional charge to Japanese subscribers who only had access to the abstracts in Japanese. Finally, these engineering or logic diagrams have become templates for the experience and service design visualizations. If we look at an old radio, such as this one, turning the dial on the radio was a metaphor for interacting with the device. But the electrical engineers who developed this had developed their own visual language to describe and replicate what was going on inside the electronic device. Wiring diagrams like this contain symbols for each of the electronic components, and they were also the inspiration for Beck's transportation diagram. This is the first service design map done by Lynn Shostak. And essentially, it's a logic diagram. That line of visibility near the top separates the discount brokerage services that the customers see from the business processes needed to support them down below. And her black circles identify multiple fail points that should be addressed to improve the service. This form of business engineering has inspired a host of techniques to represent and analyze customer experience. This is an example of a customer journey map. These are aligned with touch points, places where people and objects are where the customers experience the service, and the diagram shows both the front stage services as well as the backstage services. So this brings me to the end of my talk. These are the 9 functional themes. I think that they're a useful way to think about and discuss the variety and unity of information design examples across time. There's a wonderful phrase in Henri Chatelain's preface to his Atlas Historique. He describes these engravings of coastlines and political boundaries as an aid provided to the imagination through the eyes. The human imagination is not an empty space to be filled with data. It contains more than the set of rational numbers and operates through a constantly changing network of connections. We perform the creative act of information design in order to communicate to the imagination through the eyes. It's easy to see how we can collectively come to identify data visualization as the sole function of information design, but I think that that's a mistake. Our biggest challenge today is not learning how to write software programs to make use of all this data, to make us ever more masters of the quantities we can record. The tools we use to shape data into images do not explain how meaning is transmitted. The psychological rules for organizing perception do not explain the multiplicity of information design strategies that people have devised over the centuries. Our biggest challenge is learning how to select and shape information to make meaning. Reviewing information design history can help us gain perspective on how quantitative and qualitative data are both part of the information design story. Thank you very much.